but a lot of people watch these on their own time, and we get a lot of good feedback subsequent. And in fact, I went back to our last conversation in July just to see what I might have missed as I was moderating, and there was a ton of good information there. So the recordings definitely get used. But if you have an issue with that, please let us know, and we will not post this particular one. Okay, so with that, I'm going to share my screen real quick and just get us into this. So give me 2 seconds here. Okay, let's see. Let me present. Okay, George joining us. So my screen should be loading. It's going very slow. Okay. So if folks can see, hopefully you're seeing a presentation somewhere up there. So just to give a quick lay of the land, we'll spend just 2 seconds on this for those who aren't here. So this is one of the 2 tracks of discussion that are currently going on in IFTBOH. One is around privacy and one is around data security, cybersecurity, and that type of thing. And Alex is leading that. Today we're talking about privacy, and this is our 4th discussion in a series. And so kind of the yellow shading here, just really quickly, you see where we've come from and where we are right now. So we've talked about scope and in areas that are really interested to this group where we think we can eventually make an impact. But if you look at the second from the right square, we realize that we don't know what we don't know on some of these topics, right? And so we really want to get a good grounding. And part of the way we do that is by having experts like Jodi and Bob join us and kind of school us on what we need to know right now. And then, then we feel like we're armed to really go at some of these issues where we think we can create some betterment for the consumer, or lead by example within the industries and in companies that we are associated with. So this grounding is super important, and I want to thank you guys for that. Just for Jodi's benefit, Bob did see this last month, but we did, and this is courtesy of our own Axel Cloth there, we did come up with a very simple stripped down definition. So Jodi, kind of the way we're thinking about privacy, and if you have any comments, please chime in, but you can see it right there on the screen. So we're going to move forward. And I'm actually, so just real quick to say, we've prioritized across eight aspects of privacy. Our top 2 first areas of focus are consumer exposure and protections, and transparency. Transparency again with the consumer in mind. So with that, I'm going to get out of sharing mode here and welcome Jodi Daniels. So Jodi is the founder and let me stop sharing. Founder and CEO of Red Clover Advisors. Red Clover Advisors is a privacy consultancy that brings data privacy strategy and compliance together with its flexible and scalable approach that simplifies data privacy complexity, refines and updates or builds privacy structure, and makes both the business and the legal issues accessible and actionable for all. So that's perfect that you're going to talk to a level that we can understand. So we appreciate that. And Jodi is a certified information privacy professional and serves as the outsourced privacy office for companies. And then we had our other guest, and Bob will be on second, but please feel free to commit, both of you, and either part of this conversation is Bob Braun. And as you'll remember, Bob's a partner at Jeffer, Butler, Mangels, and Mitchell, LLP, and is co-chair of their cybersecurity and privacy group, and specializes in transactions with an emphasis on data security, privacy, and information technology. Thanks again for joining, Bob. Okay, so with that, we have kind of 2 hemispheres of conversation today. Our first one is around corporate privacy policy and actual practice. So we got a grounding in some of what's happening within California and some of the states and at the federal level last month. And we're going to come back to that topic because there are a lot of spillover questions and really good discussion. Jodi's going to give us some insights into what's really happening, how companies are interpreting the laws today, how effective they are, and how they're being deployed. And as I mentioned to Jodi when we had a quick chat, Alex Rader, who's going to be joining us later, he had a little bit of an emergency situation come up, so that Jodi has some of the most amazing anecdotes. So not to set the bar too high, but anyway, welcome, Jodi. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, hi, everyone. It's great to see you. So I also was having all kinds of technology snafus. So you saw me looking at like my 400 screens trying to find what I was looking for. So I pulled a couple slides together. Hearing you talk again, Chris, my slides might not totally align for all of them, but it'll help set the stage. And then I can kind of talk talk through them. And funny you should talk about stories. So Bob, you'll probably appreciate this. I actually am working on a privacy notice for a company who wants like explicit control over being able to use biometric data all just through the privacy notice. If you agree to the privacy notice, you've like signed off on all of your biometric data, and this is a voice. So you record your voice and the company can kind of use the voice to perform its service. But generally you don't bury that in fine point print on a privacy notice all the way at the bottom. So that story is kind of hot off the press. So I think it's helpful to kind of understand the way I view privacy, and it really intertwines with how companies should be and how I help coach them to adopt these different privacy laws that you all have been talking about. And for me, that's because it's all a matter of trust. Privacy laws are here because someone's done something that they weren't supposed to. It's like kindergarten where the little kid, hit the other kid. And so now everyone has to sit in their seats until the teacher says you can't anymore. It's the same kind of situation. People are not buying from companies, more than 50% of them, in fact, because they don't trust what the company is going to do with the data. And why don't they trust them? Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. And why else does privacy matter? Well, you've talked about all the laws. You got that covered, it sounds like. I think it's also really important to understand, and the policies help further undermine, or not undermine, but further why you need to be doing these things. You have vendors. You might be a vendor, or the company has its vendors, and you need to make sure everyone in the ecosystem is cooperating. You might have investors. So I'm actually working on a due diligence matter right now where company A won't buy company B if they don't feel warm and fuzzy about the privacy and security. And then your customers. I've already shared, especially in the consumer side, that 50% of people won't buy from them. More than 80% of people don't feel comfortable. They still might buy, but they're not super happy. In the B2B context, I see this all the time where a contract will come and they can't sign the deal because they don't have their privacy ducks in a row. They might have the security pieces, but they don't have the privacy part. And so kind of how did we get here? I'm going to not go through all of these slides, but if you just kind of put yourself in the eyes of your customer, think about your day and where you're being tracked. Think about all the IoT devices that are in the universe, all the digital apps and websites that you've shown up at, you've ordered from, you've checked. Every place is collecting data. Now, imagine if there was someone behind you collecting and notating all of that physically. You'd kind of turn around and say, who are you and why are you stalking me? But that's what we do online. Even if you didn't buy something, just every single digital data point is being collected and analyzed in some form or fashion. Here's just a few stats to kind of further emphasize how people aren't super happy. 30% of people block software. Between 30 and 40% of people want to make decisions and choose how their information is going to be used. They want the control over it. 8 in 10 adults were concerned about how their information is being used. Here's the 50% stat that I just mentioned. And then 10% of people, so think about your CPG products, your Procter and Gamble's and all of those, 10% of companies trust them, or media and entertainment companies. Here's a story. I am a happy Disney owner. I love Disney. I'm a Disney shareholder, a Disney Plus person. I have Disney mugs from when I was in college that, yes, I bought. I love Disney. And yesterday, I got an email that I swore, who on earth is this email? I did not sign up for this email. And I look and I say, well, who on earth is sending this? I want to go unsubscribe after I confirmed it wasn't a phishing email. And it turns out to be some Disney subsidiary using my email address from about 10 years ago. And it's actual Disney. It is Walt Disney Company. You go to the opt-out page. It's truly Walt Disney. Sorry to slam on you, Walt Disney. And this is being recorded. I love you, Walt Disney. However, that is terrible. Why on earth are you emailing me from 10 years ago? So talking about a policy, the companies have to understand the data that they have and the consumer expectation and the privacy notice. And whatever this email was about was not like some entertainment thing that means absolutely nothing to me in my universe. I was not a very happy Disney person and I unsubscribed. here's all the bad things that happen to you when you don't comply. And you have probably likely covered these before whenever you're talking about any of these privacy laws. There's fines, there's data breaches. I mentioned the lost sales and the loss of trust. Those to me are the biggest hooks. Could there be a fine? Absolutely. Can there be a data breach? You're going to cover all those security measures. The likelihood of a regulator coming and finding you, it's possible, but the bigger likelihood is your customers and them being not so happy, or you using data in a way that makes no sense, like my Disney story I just shared. You might have also seen this. You don't see a whole lot of gray. These are all the states that don't have anything happening quite yet, but there's lots of blue and red that have nothing to do with party lines. And this is the way I like to approach privacy. And it kind of comes from the different laws and many of the requirements that these different laws are asking companies to adhere to. And this is really where it gets into what companies actually have to do to say, I comply with CCPA, to say I comply with GDPR, and so on and so forth. And it can intersect with the other laws. I was talking to a healthcare company this morning. If you're already having to comply with HIPAA, you might have some of these things, but that doesn't cover you for all of the data because that company likely has data beyond just the HIPAA specific covered data. The same could be true in a financial institution. Anyone who's covered by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act has data beyond just Gramm-Leach-Bliley. Kind of start with establishing governance. Who's going to be responsible? You need a sponsor. This is true for any corporate, small or big initiative. You need someone who's going to be paying attention to it. And with that, you kind of establish your principles, your strategy, what is important to you, and even how much of this you're going to do. Now, missing on my little chart are little arrows. They're going to come in the next version. I like to do this kind of established governments. Almost imagine it's a clock at 12 o'clock and we go around. In my perfect universe, we would do all of these at the same time and they'd all be done, but there's reality and companies need to kind of start on a path. Policies and standards, your external privacy notice, that's the one that explains to the consumer, here's what we're using about you. If you're in California, you need an employee privacy notice. It says, here's what we're collecting about you. The same if you're in the EU. Companies also have internal privacy policies. Here's what we as a company will do with the information. If Disney had an internal privacy notice that they were following, I might not have gotten such a strange email yesterday. You also are going to have all your security policies. You could kind of put them here. You could sort of put them on its friend on the other side for security. But think about all the policies and standards. Some companies will have a rule book, standard operating procedures, any type of consistent guidance so that employees understand what they need to be doing. And the privacy notice needs to be reviewed at least once a year, but really more than that. Because anytime you go through what we call a privacy impact assessment or a data inventory or marketing activities, all of that needs to come back, especially to the external privacy notice. Any of you actually ever read a privacy notice before?
A little bit.
That's okay. I appreciate the few hands. So here's kind of a fun story, real story, picking on another company. I won't name this one by name though. You might figure it out. So this is an absolute true story. My husband and I and my daughter were mattress shopping, and we decided to go to a very popular store that the bed can adjust and it comes with a number. And in doing so, it talked about all of the technology features of this bed. Salesperson was adamant. It has Wi-Fi. Look at all these cool things it's going to measure. And we were thinking, well, how are you going to use the data? And how long are you going to keep it? And how are you securing my sleep habits and my heart rate that you're collecting that you never asked me if I wanted to in the first place? And where can I find all of this information? First off, he thought we were crazy. And for those of you who don't know, my husband is a business attorney with a cybersecurity specialty. So we're like, we're privacy and security crazy people. And he thought we're crazy people asking about privacy and security. And like all normal people on a Saturday night, we go back and we pull up the privacy notice, to which it really doesn't explain a whole lot of what they're doing with our sleep information. Had the experience been different, what it should have had is here's the privacy notice in the store while we're shopping. And it should have addressed what is really happening with the data. It's I mean, it covers it technically speaking, but as a consumer, it just covered it from a legal perspective. Didn't really make me feel warm and fuzzy as a customer. It's really important to be able to have that privacy notice because it means something, especially as we continue to move into more digital data. It's not just a legal requirement from all the various laws. Data inventory, you need to understand all the data you have because you can't write one of these beautiful privacy notices that people like me want to read if I don't know what kind of data you have. And the same is first off, certain laws require you to have that data. The next big piece about all these privacy laws is choices. You have all kinds of rights, individual rights. Well, you can't manage those if you don't have any idea what type of data you have. The data inventory is critical, and that should help drive what type of deeper review you need to have, any type of new product, new marketing, new activity, new business line, new venture, updates, and that will help fuel the updates to the privacy notices, internal and external, help you determine how you need to protect that data, and help you figure out how you're going to manage it from an individual rights perspective, meaning Jodi asks you to delete my data. Great. Do you know where it is? What about vendors? Do you know which vendors are in play? We often talk about vendor management in the security aspects. The privacy piece is, well, what are you doing with my data, Mr. Vendor? Are you going to use it for yourself? Are you going to analyze it? Are you going to use any of the information in aggregate? Are you going to help me comply with any of my privacy obligations? And you can see there, that's the connection that I see often from a B2B perspective. One, a company could be a service provider or be the vendor, but it also probably has some vendors. And it also has to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to. In GDPR and EU speak, we call that kind of downstream a sub-processor. So one of my clients is a technology company. They're a processor to clients, and they utilize some third parties to help them create their product. And those companies are sub-processors. And we always have to make sure that they're adhering to the laws. And a kind of a fun fact is that one of those one time they said, oh no, we're too small to have to comply with the California law. We don't have to do that. I said, but if you're providing services for us, you actually have to comply with the law. I don't care how small you are. You're providing services for us. The next week, guess what happened? We received a contract that ensured that they were complying with the law. Security, training. You need to train people not just on security, but also on privacy. What does it mean for their daily job? What is the latest with the new laws? And then you do all this and you try and figure out how you rinse and repeat. Some type of sustainable method that's often a combination of people, process, and technology. So these other slides I had were just a little bit more around, like know the data, because the key questions you have to ask, what you have, how you use it, where it's stored, and who you share it with. Really, again, to emphasize, one, it's required under a variety of laws. Two, you need this information to determine what vendors are in play and what requirements you might have. You need that information to make sure you can write an accurate privacy notice. People will sometimes say, please just write a notice. And I'm going to say, okay, what kind of data do you have? I can't just write a notice. I need to understand what you have and how you're using it. If you're sharing or selling, I also need to know that. So these are the very specific definitions out of selling is out of CCPA, sharing is out of CPRA, which I'm assuming you all have covered so far. Fun privacy acronym soup. And if you read these really detailed, unique definitions, you will understand that a lot could be considered selling or sharing. And one of the main pieces that is often considered here is all the digital advertising. And it's really important to understand what type of digital advertising or digital analytics is taking place. That company that might be collecting that information could be using it for themselves, and under the law is often interpreted as a sale or sharing of that data. And when that happens, there's a variety of different requirements that have to take place. You find the selling and sharing out because we just did that whole data inventory before. So the data inventory is the foundation of really any program. One of the questions I always like to ask is, can I use this data? The European laws require companies to think first. They have certain legal requirements. Can I, can't I? The US laws are moving towards having to think first. So you kind of say, all right, yep, I'm allowed to use the data. And if not, you need to go back to the drawing board. It's where we are now is getting companies to think first before they just collect and use anything that they want. And that all kind of ties back to what we were talking about before with understanding the data that you have and consumer trust and explaining to customers of what it is that you're collecting. Companies need to use all that to market responsibly or just use the data responsibly. There's the famous flashlight app that was collecting contact information. Why does a flashlight app need my contact information? You're just a flashlight. I just need you to make the light camera thing work, not collect my contact information. So not just necessarily marketing responsibly, but using the data responsibly as well. And why I love privacy notices so much is I think they're the opportunity to connect with our customers. And it's the culmination of all the company's privacy practices, externally facing. This is where you can explain how you are collecting and using that data, but not just the technical pieces, but really how you view the exchange of information. And if you want someone, for example, to give more data to you, I might be hesitant. Remember, 50% of people don't want to actually give me data. How can I give them comfort? I can explain what I'm going to do with it. I can do that really simply, maybe a summary. And what you are going to start seeing are more summary pages, more privacy web pages. And I don't mean the long privacy notice. I mean an actual like privacy portal page. Microsoft is a great example if you want to go and look at it. And while a smaller company might not be Microsoft, the concept applies where it's kind of big visual boxes that explains, I collect this, here's my choices, here's my principles, all in one central place. Companies are calling them trust centers. Why? So that we trust, because we've gone so far in the other direction of distrust that we now need to have actual pages where you can explain how you trust me. This is also a great place to emphasize all the security measures that a company has. Maybe if there's a SOC 2 certification or an ISO certification, people are listing it there. If there's a data protection addendum, people are listing it there. You're kind of putting all the privacy and security information in one place that allows someone to interact with the company and the brand and understand everything that's happening. So that's the external part. And then they have to move upward to create those internal processes and policies to make sure that they're in sync. What you wouldn't want is for Jodi to go to your beautiful external privacy page or individual rights section and say, I want you to delete my data. And Sally over here in the department gets this request and has no idea what you're talking about and emails and says, I can't delete your data. We don't do that here. You have no rights. That wouldn't be a very good experience for the consumer. So we have to make sure we have a process in place. These laws also require us to do things in a certain time. California says, and Virginia says we have 45 days to manage one of those individual rights requests. The European Union gives you 30. How are you going to manage that process internally? So again, they're kind of all interconnected. And kind of really my last big point is it's an opportunity to engage with customers. No matter where in a company the data is, it's really the way, if you're looking for more data, people need to ask internally, can I use that data? Should I use that data? Do I have a standard procedure of what I can and can't do? Oh, I don't, maybe we need one. What does the outside person say that or think we're going to use? If it's a B2B relationship, what does my contract say? Does my contract say I can put all that data together, or does it limit me? You have to look at all of those, but it really is an opportunity to build a long-lasting relationship because it's all about the data, and data is going to be what is digital, is transforming us in this digital transformation age. We're at a massive rate of technology innovation. And I don't believe that privacy laws have to restrict what companies are doing. I had someone the other day say, well, I just won't sell in the EU. It is harder. There are things we have to be doing, but it shouldn't impede revenue opportunities. You just have to do it smartly. And so those are really all the slides that I had. And I was hoping that people would have some questions and we could just kind of talk about them.
And we have several in the chat. Yep.
Great. And here's just sort of a fun, if you really like all this stuff, we have, she said privacy, he said security podcast, because that's what everyone should have, is a husband and wife podcast.
Nice. Nice. That's great.
Yep. Yeah. So I'll stop sharing my screen as soon as I can figure out how to do. Here we go. All right. We have questions. Lots of questions. I wasn't reading any. Okay.
No, and thank you for that. That was awesome. So I think that's a great conversation here. All
right. So what exactly do we want all this data collected off the mattress in the first place? Yes, that is a really great question. Hi. All right. Are there any regulations that are requiring plain language and consumer disclosures, thinking along the lines of the reforms in financial services? They actually all say they should be plain language. But the reality is, at the same time, they then say you have to disclose all of these things and be in plain language, which it like doesn't compute. It's saying one thing over here and something else on the other side, because some of the requirements are really long. Mm-hmm. The reality is it is plain language, and that is why and there are some companies moving to kind of like a nutrition label, and actually Apple is even trying to move to the nutrition label concept. California tried that years ago. It didn't really take off. It might come back. There are actual companies trying to help their customers with the privacy nutrition label like concept. I think what you're going to find more than that adoption is more of the summary adoption in a very visual way. Big boxes that are collection, use, sharing, choices, and with like summaries. And then here's the long detailed notice by country and by state. I think that's the direction we're going to move to first. Haha. I like the sleep apnea question. I mean, I'm not kidding. This is total true story. I did not make that one up. Can amplify change after I buy a product? Can a policy change? Oh, can a policy maybe like, can a privacy policy change after I buy a product? It can. However, depending on how they want to use the data, they may or may not need to come back to you. It really sort of depends on what the use case is that they're trying to do.
Well, that's all hypothetical. That's hypothetical, because the simple matter of the fact is they bank on the fact that you don't have a current time-stamped version of the policy at that point in time. So you have no way of suing them if they violate what they prior said they would keep secret, right? Nobody does that.
Well,
I mean, but I'm the only exception, because when I sign up to something where I have a doubt about the privacy policy, I take a snapshot of it, I sign the damn thing so that nobody can dispute it, and then I have it in writing. And then if I need to go to court, I have a time-stamped version of it and say, here's what you said then, this is my privacy, now you are doing the opposite, sorry, give me money, right? But I'm probably one of the very, very, very few people who does that.
So I would agree, that's probably in the minority, though. I would say that there are a lot of sites where you have to accept the privacy policy. And in doing so, that checkbox is often doing a log. And
yes,
in doing
but
that
they have the log. You don't.
They have the log.
Point, right?
Right. No, they have
if
the log.
You want, there's an old German saying, wer schreibt, der bleibt. He who writes gets to stay. If you don't have anything in writing, you are screwed.
That's a fair point. So I'm really coming from a consumer standpoint. You're right. From a company standpoint, it is the company's obligation to maintain that track record of privacy notices and any material changes. And there are obligations that if you have material changes, the process that you're supposed to go through to update them.
That's right. But again, they have it and they can submit it to the court if it's in their advantage. And if they don't, then they don't, right? The point is, unless
wait a second. If someone asks the company to provide that information, if someone gets a subpoena or it's in a court proceeding, they're required to do that. And if they don't, they face much more significant potential damages and actions. I think your assumption, which I think is incorrect, is that companies continually act in bad faith.
They do.
Jodi and I work with, we work with people say, I want to comply. How do I comply?
Yeah,
Um,
I can tell
mean,
you.
you just, I think that I think you're making an assumption that is probably not entirely correct. It happens, but it's not a universal assumption.
I'm
so
sorry
don't-
for barging in.
Yes.
I'm
Again,
sorry.
but then you're trusting, right? And I'm not trusting. That's the point. I don't trust anybody.
May I chime in, please? We're talking about a situation that should not be happening in general. We're talking about enforcement of the law by individual consumers that have been wronged. And this is not feasible, period. It's not feasible in principle, because as a consumer, I will probably not be able to enforce the privacy law, even if I have everything in writing and everything else. Anyone who has ever been involved in any kind of litigation involving small claims court knows that litigating something is a huge drain on someone's resources of time, money, energy, and everything else. Yes, the law can be subpoenaed, but what's the point? It's entirely, totally wrong on principle to leave enforcement of privacy laws to the consumers, period. So it doesn't even need to be discussed any further. Sorry about interruption.
There's, if I may add one more thing, I yet to understand is a privacy thing that I get and sign. Is it is it part of the contract? Is it a contract between myself and that company? And if they go and change their policy, they've just changed the contract on me?
Yep.
Yes. Bob, this is
Correct.
true.
So I think Jodi actually handled the companies regularly change their privacy policies in order to comply with the law and in order to accurately reflect their collection and use of data. If they change their policies such that their use of data that they collect, that they've already collected, is different. So for example, if they say, we never sell your data, and then they decide to sell your data, or we never share your data, and they decide to share your data, they have to get consent from the user. It's explicit in the law.
Okay.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So they basically, if they do some change in the contract that is meaningful to me, or supposed to be, or might be meaningful to me as the other side of that contract, as the consumer who signed that contract when I bought the product, they must go through me, and I need to say yes or no. Otherwise, they cannot.
Well, I mean, this is very naive to assume, right? Do you think that the department that does the data collection oftentimes isn't even in-house? That's outsourced to somebody who then outsources it to Google or to somebody else of that evil nature, and then the shit comes back to the company, and believe me, they won't even inform their own legal department of that change. If you assume that they do, you are naive.
So I'm gonna keep us moving. Sorry, but I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to keep us moving because these, not to stifle the topic, and we can certainly come back to it. But and I'm just going to shorthand this just to say to Jodi and Bob, the financial services in the U.S. has been hyper regulated for good reason, right? A lot of bad things happened over the years, and all of us have seen the brokerage statements. What they call it, the not boxes. You're not insured. Are there some lessons? We're trying to think as tech leaders of best practices we should be taking forward. So I guess I would say, are there best practices that you could see adopting? Like, for example, none of us have a mortgage where we don't have every stipulation that was part of the contract at the time. We don't all have that in our paper files, right? Are there some other constructs that might be helpful in this context, regardless of enforceability, but just in the sense of full transparency and disclosure of what you've agreed to at a point in time? Anyway,
I'll throw out that I think that what Jodi mentioned at the very beginning about the collection, I think you said of biometric data.
Mhm.
I think much more important than the privacy policy. Well, not privacy policy is very important, but what is impactful is the notice of collection. That anyone who collects data, it's at least covered by the California, Colorado, and Virginia laws, is required at the time they collect the data, whether it's, and that, by the way, includes all technologies, whether it's online through your computer, on a smartphone, on paper, is required to advise a consumer of advise a consumer of the use to which they will of the uses of that data. That's the and that is typically done for, if nothing else other than real estate, it's done in a short form, especially if so much is done by on mobile devices. And that is what there's always a link to the privacy policy, and privacy policies, and I think Jodi would agree, are challenging to write. They're challenging to write, and we see, I read these things all the time, and the laws themselves say on one hand, well, you have to be clear and coherent, and on the other hand, they put roadblocks up against it. This, you have to indicate what qualifiers. But I think the notice of collection is what tells the consumer, and what allows the consumer to ensure that that they can enforce their privacy rights.
So maybe a takeaway from all of that is, as we think about our own products, we should make sure that we have full transparency, and there's a repository in some fashion, whether we've sent it to the customer electronically or whether they log in their settings, they see, watermark the exact document they agreed to at that point in time. Even if things change, they can know where they started, and maybe things have drifted enough where they're not comfortable. I think that was some of the questions I was hearing too. What about things change after I agree?
So typically what happens is companies keep a log of their privacy notices, and when they update or change them, it might even say at the top, and you've probably seen this before, privacy notice updated, and it'll have the date, and it might even stay for 30 days, or there's a little banner or a little something that says updated, and then they're keeping an internal record of that. And like I had shared before, a lot of time, not always, but sometimes if you're agreeing to buy something, someone will have a check mark, I agree to this privacy notice and terms. That's all part of the transaction log. And if ever necessary, you'd be able to kind of tie back to what you're doing. But part of the whole idea of a privacy program is that someone should be ensuring and working with the different parts of a company, so that if you say what you're saying in a privacy notice, that the company is actually doing it. Is it always perfect? There's reality. Doing nothing is also not the right answer. The movement to trying to have those data inventories, someone talking to the different parts in the company, are where they're going to have that cohesiveness.
I think you're still going out from the fact that companies know what they're actually doing, and they don't. Most companies outsource most of the operations, particularly intelligence gathering, particularly anything that has to do with data. I can guarantee you, if you go to Mattress Center or whatever the name of the company is, they can't tell you where they collect data, what data they collect, because it's all outsourced. And their legal department doesn't know that either, because they fundamentally don't care.
Well, I can appreciate that some companies might be that way. I know I work with a lot of companies who are familiar with their data, and they're becoming more and more. That's part of where we are right now, is we're at a place where companies are forced to really get to know where that information is. So I do think definitely not perfection. You're going to have some bad apples, but I do think that you have a lot of companies who are trying to do the right thing, and who do know where a good amount of their data is, and they're trying to move forward to find all of it.
Well,
yeah, that we,
right.
we advise our clients, and our clients are concerned about their potential liability. And one of the things we work with is vendors, because it's absolutely true. I mean, the security issues have been typically vendor-based, or supply chain issues, more and more supply chain issues. And we work with vendors, and any vendor that work with, whether it's a matter of fulfilling, whether it's a matter of processing transactions, they enter into agreements that require, among other things, that the data only, along sort of like a GDPR concept, that they act solely as data processors, and they can't use the data other than for the purposes that they are contracted to do so, and that they have to comply with individual rights requests. So, that is something that there are active contracts about that.
Great. And I'm going to jump in here because Jodi has been so patient, and she needs to jump. There were 2 questions I had for both you and Bob, so maybe I'll pose them on your way out and I'll follow up with you on the answers if you're okay, Jodi.
That'd be fine. Thank you so
okay.
much. I appreciate everyone's insight.
great.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so
Okay,
much, Jodi.
Thank you.
All right,
Thanks a lot.
bye.
Okay.
Great, awesome. And not to truncate that conversation, but we have Mr. Braun on for some follow up from last. We had spirited conversations last month too, and that's a good thing. So I thought what I would do, because not everyone was on the call. I had a little bit of a recap, and Bob, please jump in. I was just going to hit a few of the highlights of what you covered, and then go to some of the open questions we had, if that makes sense there. So first of all, Bob was generous and made the deck available. So if you haven't seen it yet, we can make sure it's on the site, but a ton of information there particularly around CCPA and CPRA. And we got a lot of great feedback that it was incredibly well structured and a resource for folks. So definitely check that out if you haven't. So I'm not going to cover too much on that because the deck actually stands on its own there. But just extracting a few things that you shared with us, Bob. And again, if I get any of this wrong or kind of you put it a little different way, please chime in. But around best practices to reduce data theft, there were 3 that you called out. Data minimization, limiting the amount of data collected, really being really strict about that. Purpose limitations, so what is the data really to be used for, not overstepping the bounds there. And then storage limitations, keeping it at the absolute minimal amount of time you have to and expunging it as quickly as you can. So those are what I took from that piece of the conversation. Some really important things for us all to think about, and all things that lower our threat surface, right, if we do them. We had a spirited discussion on around what's reasonable data security to be exercised by companies. And I think that's really a hot button with us as this group here, right? We don't think it's been, I'll just speak for several people on the call, but we don't think it's been stringent enough. We don't think that the penalties have been exacting enough when someone has actually shown really poor hygiene around protecting customer data. I think we all heard what happened with T-Mobile and 40 million applications yesterday, right? It's a great name, address, social, and driver's license, and everything else you could want from someone, and what's going to happen because of that. But you had actually pointed out there's a little bit of hope. You pointed out 2 things, kind of in a best practice sense there. You said that Colorado and Virginia were enacting, or maybe they've already enacted, a stipulation about regular security assessments, and they have to report into a central authority about how they're protecting data itself. And it seemed like that could be a model that maybe should be at a federal level, right, and nationwide. And you also said at the federal level, there's not a lot of high expectations there. Things are moving pretty slowly. One thing that may be helpful is the executive order requiring sharing around information breaches. Right now, that's been very close to the vest, so people aren't learning from each other within the industry. So the tide may raise all boats on that front. And then a bit about states legislation. I think one of the things you called out is that Virginia in particular looks like an interesting model. Their CDPA might be something that the nation gravitates toward. And in your deck, there's a handful of slides that really outline the specifics of that. And kind of a cousin to that seemed interesting was the Colorado Privacy Act, which is more in line with Virginia than our California regulations, and a few interesting distinctions, including requiring support of universal opt-out for marketing purposes. So the default is not that you've opted in until you say otherwise. You have to, you have to universal opt-out of everything, and then it was opt-in of certain data points like racial and ethnic origin, religious beliefs, biometrics, genetics, that type of thing. So, and then you also pointed us to some interesting legislation being talked about around biometrics and geolocation in New York and Illinois. So those are just some of the highlights. Bob, I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to punctuate there from that conversation.
Not really. I mean, you've hit all the high points. It's, we could talk, you guys are talking a lot about it, but I'd be happy to go to questions or comments or,
Yeah, we had a couple from the group that I'll just start with those and open it up to this group, right? So anything you want to ask now. One was more of a tactical question. So anything surrounding the right to be forgotten or having your data expunged or removed. what proof can consumers demand, and should they worry about whether their wishes have been fully carried out? And should they take it on face value that the data has been addressed?
Well, I don't think Axel will be happy with the answer, but a company, let's take the CCPA because that's the one that that's one I've obviously spent the most time on, is the one that's actually in effect. When someone sends in a deletion request, first of all, it has to be acknowledged within 15 days. It has to be acted upon within 45 days or up to an additional 45 days if it's difficult. And I'll tell you, a lot of times, one of the problems is you don't get enough information. Somebody sends in a note saying, delete my information, but you have no idea who it is, and you have to follow up on it. And that's why it can be one of the reasons it can be extended. That's been one of our challenges. If not all data has to be deleted if you're required to hold on to data for legal reasons or in order to complete a transaction or something like that. You can keep it, but you have to notify the client. You have to notify the consumer of that. If you don't get a response within the 15, or you don't get a definitive statement within 45 days, or notice of extension within 45 days, and therefore it extends out, then they've breached the law, and you can bring, in California, you can bring what amounts to a PAGA action, a private attorney general action, or you can, these days, I'd suggest that you go to the cop on the block, which is the CPPA, the California Privacy Protection Agency, because they actually have a budget and people to go after people who are, they have a better jurisdiction. One of the nice things is that I think, as Axel mentioned, is an issue of resources. How are you going to fight a big company? Well, the government is a big company, and the government and I know the people on the CPPA board. They're extremely consumer oriented. I mean, to the point where my clients are heard about it. So that's sort of a way of saying. I mean, how do you know? It's because they have to tell you. They have to tell you if they don't respond, or if you think there's something wrong. There is a body out there which is devoted to this. And I think in Colorado and Virginia, they're looking more at the Attorney General to do it. But they also, there's thought, and then of course there's the FTC, but they only get involved in, they have limited jurisdiction. So I don't know if that's entirely responsive or even partially responsive. But.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm kind of clearing up the questions from last month. This was actually one I had. So you talked to us about CPRA, and you'd mentioned that it was a quick switch for, I think, what was called the Privacy for All bill, which was supported by the ACLU and EFF, among others, and seemingly well intended. And I think you said that the Valley stepped in and said, this is going to be a disaster. We need to make something that actually honors that to a degree, but is better and more actionable and easier to enforce. I'm paraphrasing here. So if that's all true, and you explained to us kind of some of the thresholds increased around number of records and whatnot, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. So if you were looking at what was proposed with the Privacy for All bill and then what ended up being enacted through the CPRA, do you think there was anything that was left on the table, wasn't really fully addressed by what was originally proposed and what ended up becoming law?
It's pretty comprehensive. There wasn't a lot left on the table. I mean, the biggest things, I think that I would tell you, I think frankly that the big changes, creation of the CPPA, the shift from selling data to sharing data, those were the biggest issues to me. They're also, I think that they did something which is helpful, and I think this is where they didn't do all of it. The GDPR has principles, has 11 principles for data privacy. I mean, data protection. The GDPR does not ever mention privacy. It's not a privacy, it's a data protection regulation. But I think they could have, what they did leave on the table were more comprehensive principles. And the reason that I think that's important is that it's an endemic problem to legislation in the United States, is that we legislate by anecdotes, basically. We legislate on the basis of individual cases, and so we get a law dealing with an individual case. My partner, and I for a while didn't, I may put it back up, is a list of the GDPR principles. Because when we get a question about compliance with the GDPR, we can just look at those and say, oh, you know, the right to be forgotten, the right to correction, the right to portability, things like that. And I think if they had spent more time on that, and I'm not a big fan of a GDPR, and it's flawed and it hasn't proved to be entirely effective, but I think it's much easier to deal with broad principles to guide your compliance. And for consumers to understand what their rights are. So other than that, I think, you know, it's interesting. I mean, the tech companies did a tremendous amount of lobbying on this and got very little for it. So
great, thanks. I'd like to, I have two more questions that I had for you and Jodi that I'll hold back toward the end. So I'd like to open it to any other conversation. I know there was one topic we had to cut short in particular last week around, is it possible, and actually I know you had a point of view, and I think you might have been talking to Bill Richardson about this offline, but is it possible or reasonable to have a single overarching privacy procedure that covers both the US and EU? Like, could you have, that was one of the questions that came up last week, last month. We didn't have a lot of time to explore that, but could you build the big framework, and then obviously there'd be modifications within that for regions, but it's, as opposed to having all of these bespoke systems, policies, compliance standards and whatnot.
Well, it would be nice. I mean, conceptually, I think that's what we should have. I mean, we shouldn't be dealing with with different policies, because it just creates confusion and expense for anyone who's trying to comply with it and anyone trying to exercise their rights. I think that there actually is a movement towards some kind of convergence with data requirements, with data protection requirements in the US and in Europe. The biggest difference, and the one that is standing in the way, is that the United States is not companies. I mean, we focus on companies here, but the objection that Europe has to, and the main reason why we're not considered a safe place to send data, is because of the US government, because the United States government, ever since 9/11, has focused on its ability to surveil, and has very, very broad surveillance rights. I'm not going to say, I know people in the business and in that end of the business, and I think that is what's keeping it, because the United States is in that area is much more concerned about a 9/11 occurring than countries like Germany or Poland, who have a history of intrusive, in fact, most European countries have very intrusive, who have a history of bad experiences with intrusive governments, I'll put it that way. So I think that's a significant issue. And that's probably the thing that is going to continue to be, aside from the fact that everybody wants their own law, that's probably the biggest hurdle to having sort of universal privacy.
Thank you. I know we have a few questions in the chat that have come up in the last few minutes, and then also, folks, feel free to. We're in a small group today to have just a little more of a verbal. Why don't we address the ones in the chat first, Tori?
Sure.
So Irina, I'm looking at your question there. could there possibly be a technological solution to the collection of data and control over its use? So something that kind of a framework that keeps track of which type of data is coming from which device and what the strictures are around that. I think, Irene, is what you're asking.
Not exactly. What I'm thinking about is more over the lines similar to VPN, something that would interfere with collection of data from my devices. Especially I'm concerned about the IoT stuff, because when you get a mattress that records your biometric data, when you get a fridge that analyzes what's put into it, you've got an enormous surveillance network that monitors your behavior to such a granular level that you are an open victim for anyone, from relatively harmless email spammers to people who can at one day just come in and take all your money and kill you. And I'm not exaggerating. I work in an area where I see all sorts of things happening to people. And my question here is, can something be done on my end, like disabling the capabilities of those IoT devices? Because very soon we will not be able to replace an old refrigerator with a new one without actually dealing with this problem.
Then you would have to be able to disable Bluetooth and wireless LAN, wireless WAN, possibly NFC and all of those.
Well, not necessarily. It depends on what data is collected. For example, I once bought a Fitbit because I wanted a pedometer and I wanted a simple mechanical version that just counts steps. I couldn't get one. I got a Fitbit. I never connected it to the internet. It worked fine all the way until the battery died. And then it became just a useless piece of plastic because I cannot use it. I replaced the battery, it doesn't work. So when we're talking about something more substantial than a Fitbit that collects your personal information, and I'm talking here about information about your body, about your health, about your habits, about what you eat, what you drink, and who you socialize with, how can we disable that without actually becoming specialists in opening devices and, you know, short-circuiting them or whatever?
You can't. It's inherent. You can't. So either you use it or you don't. That's really as simple as that.
Cannot go back to washboard.
Well,
Actually,
it's interesting because I've talked to some of my clients who develop these things, and I mean, you know, we wanted during COVID, because we were tired of vacuuming all the time, we got one of these little robots, and we specifically got one that isn't Bluetooth enabled at all. And you know, and I can tell you, you know, I just turned off all the things in our house, and you know, I tell people, don't, you know, we can, but we didn't hook up the wireless on our thermostat and things like that. You know, there are, I think there actually is an increasing demand for products, IoT products that either do not have connectivity or where connectivity is optional.
Right.
So that's that we're seeing, but that's, you know, to say it, but you know, it's a demand issue. And I think people are, with all of the, again, you know, this is what my clients tell me, what my partners tell me when they, or other attorneys tell me when they're looking at things, there's a lot of people are looking at things where, why have it? You know, why have the IoT? I mean, most people, I would say most people who read the papers or in the knowledge, understand the problem with IoT devices. They just have really bad security, and there are billions of them.
Right, and so that's part of the bigger problem, right? Because I mean, the IoT is called IoT because it's the Internet of Things, and if you look at the industrial Internet of Things coming up on top of that, theoretically, of course, we could make it as, as engineers, we could make it all secure by establishing a VPN between, let's say, your Fitbit and your watch, right? Or your Fitbit or your part of the cloud that you trust. But the problem is then we would have to bank on people being able and willing to learn how to set up a VPN. And that's not flying. Believe me, I've used PKI for email encryption for 20 years. And I vowed that only I would communicate with people who use PKI, right? And the matter of the fact is you can't, because nobody else uses it, sets it up. So therefore you're back to insecure email that anybody can spy on. That's part of the problem. Part of the issue is, in fact, like democracy, security is not a spectator sport. You have to be involved. You have to learn how it works. You have to learn how to manage it. If you don't, well, then you don't, right? So in a lot of ways, the blame goes back to people who say, oh, I want this and I want this, but I don't want that.
Yeah,
So,
one thing I would say on the security end, when we get involved in a data breach, and there's a cloud factor involved, which means every data breach. The thing that we look at is the configuration of the connection. That is, most of the cloud suppliers have very good, very effective security measures, but if it's not configured correctly, it doesn't exist. And
correct.
And that's one of the things that we end up, looking at people telling, this is what you got to fix. You've got to fix your configuration, because it's still a question of who has access. What is your trust level, things like that. And if
right,
you don't fill up
can I ask a question? Guys, can I jump in with a simple question? Does anybody use Comcast in their house?
I do.
You do. You use Comcast. Do you have a wireless from Comcast on your
No.
system? Why not?
Because I need to be able to deploy both IPv4 and IPv6 within my house. So I have a device that allows me to break that network apart, and I need to segregate my network from my children who constantly get viruses.
I'll tell you why. Because you're a sophisticated human being with a lot of knowledge in security and networking. Most people don't. Robert, Robert, are you Bob? Are you using Comcast? Do you have wireless on your Comcast?
Spectrum. He's in LA. Spectrum.
Oh, so he's in LA, so it's Spectrum.
We have Spectrum, but I don't use their wireless.
Even if you don't use their wireless, is their wireless on all the time and you have zero control over turning it off unless you get root access?
I use a different. I have a different wireless router. I have a wired router from them, but I don't use their equipment. I use my own.
So I've been using, when I started to work with Comcast, they said, okay, we've got wireless, and said, and I needed a modem that did specific things, and only the modem with the wireless could have done what I wanted. So I said, I want to turn the wireless off. And I had to go through a lot of hooks and loops to turn it off. And the reason is because Comcast is using it for other things. So you become a service point for them. The mere fact, so I'm looking at, and it's beyond it, it's obviously also your privacy, because at that point they can monitor any connection that you do wireless, or every wireless connection in your environment is being monitored by Comcast. There are a zillion of other things. Or, I know we think that those companies are enlightened, and I know that there are plenty of companies who are more gentle, and they hire yourself and they hire the right people to figure out how to do it right. But that's my personal experience with some large companies like Comcast is not very good. It's not very positive. I can't trust them. I lost trust very quickly when I had to go through those loops. And these are just some examples. The thing is that we are using in our houses all sorts of things that we don't think are smart. They are not yet IoT, but they are so easy to get into and to monitor our activities from within our houses. And in some cases, they're actually being used. They're used for different traffic, for different things that has nothing to do with us. And we never signed up for that, okay? So that's kind of like a side thing. But I'm not sure how to deal with that. I don't know how the legal, and I'm not going to go and sue anyone. I don't have time for that. I'll never deal with lawsuit on privacy with anyone. I would like to figure out a way. And for me, it's like, where's the money? So where is the money? Why companies are doing what they're doing? Once we truly understand that, then we have a prayer of a chance to deal with privacy, because the laws will do the best they can, but it still may not be good enough for most people. Anytime I step out of the house, anyone can monitor me. I'm in public, and therefore I'm fair game for whatever it is. The thing is that today's technology monitoring is beyond what an eye, like a person who wants to monitor me, who wants to look at me, they cannot figure out even 1,000th of potential of what a machine learning can figure out from monitoring me or looking at my data or doing things. I think we are, so from the law perspective, I think we are so behind what technology is doing. I feel like fish in a barrel every time in my house, right now on this call, 24/7, I feel like a fish in a barrel. And it's not because I'm scared for my life or I'm doing bad things, and I don't think anybody's going to go after me, etc. That's not the thing. But we have doors for reasons. We have homes for reasons. So once we start to understand this openness, I think there is a very uncomfortable space that we are in the past 20 years, and I do not know yet how to correct it, except for, like Irena said, can I get a device, please, that when I turn it off, no one can see me, no one can monitor me? Is there companies building devices like this? Maybe that's something that we need to build. I mean, maybe one of us should go ahead and build it, and we'll make a lot of money. But that's, again, sorry, I was ranting for like 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Well,
no, I don't.
Well, a very good rant, I must say. There is an issue here. There is an issue of personal discomfort with unusual things that do not correspond to our idea of privacy. And there is potential real harm to people. And I feel exactly like Shmuel. And I understand that a portion of it is that I'm not open to the idea that my information is out there and easily available for anyone to see. But on the other hand, if you think back a few centuries, there was time when the whole family slept in one bed, and it was perfectly normal. So getting your own bed and your own room was very revolutionary and probably as much uncomfortable as being always monitored now. And we cannot probably go away and avoid being monitored. What we can do and what we must do is prevent it from being used for nefarious purposes. And what I have seen in my line of business, tangentially, I'm not dealing with fraud per se, but I see a lot of garden variety fraud just sprouting under our feet. Well, think about all these older people and older women who are the prime target for all sorts of cons, and that activity is on the rise, and so on and so forth. And that comes from accessibility of everybody's information to everybody who wants to look and see. So at least limiting something to, well, not very harmful things.
Okay. George, you had thank you, Irene. I want to come back to that in just a second. But George, it sounded like you had a point on the same topic or the same area that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think first a couple of things. I'm going to start back with the Comcast situation. So I've been lucky enough to make great connections in my career. One of those people is the person who built out the entire IPv6 network for all of Comcast, as well as the DOCSIS RFCs and protocol designs, patented designs by Comcast that basically traverses that traffic. And he did it in a way that it became a problem for Amazon and their Sidewalk initiative. Does anyone know what Amazon's Sidewalk is? Did we talk about that? Okay, great. Yeah. Which is why they have to use Wi-Fi, your Wi-Fi connection. So for that trust factor, mainly because of the DOCSIS design that now all the cable companies use. which wouldn't allow them to basically incorporate payload into the packet on that network, in terms of how Comcast and now Spectrum and Cox and all of them use that same kind of concept. There's deep tech in there, obviously, and the mindset of most service providers, of the engineers that built those networks, is a good mindset, but once it gets out of their hands and it gets into the corporate leaders of those organizations is when they get concerned. And the issue that we typically run into with privacy concerns are when that balance between a company that's trying to build more value and sometimes more intellectual property, like I see Sidewalk as an absolute challenge in privacy and security. But it's basically just kind of, if you don't know about it, it's sending this data up into the cloud, Amazon's cloud specifically. And companies are signing on board, like Tile, and so they can connect via Bluetooth. These devices can talk to each other, and we talk about IoT and those issues. But I think the challenge that we have to recognize is that no matter what is going on within the business environment, it's the home environment that has the most risk, where most people are working from, in the sense that there are things that aren't a problem in the home environment that are a problem at work, because when I say problems, I mean specifically regulatory problems. So yeah, if you're smart, you're building things that a consumer puts in their house, where really one consumer doesn't have enough power to take you out. And it really is, in my opinion, it's a glaring hole, not only in privacy and security, but also in what essentially is, there's no product out there on the market that I'm aware of that can solve that problem and do like what I can do myself is way more than the average Joe. And so do I just leave the average Joe in the dust? Say, well, it's too bad for Joe because I'm able to do what I need to do. That's absolutely selfish, and I wouldn't do that. So I guess my point here is that what are we doing to create a almost like a kind of like a cyber protective layer over the home? Can it be done in protocol? Can it be done in regulation? Where do you start with that? And that guy that worked for Comcast now is the vice president at one of the spinoffs from Comcast called Machine Q, where they're dealing with IoT. Yeah. So that same mindset that he had when he did the design for and he fought very hard for what essentially was the way that Comcast built their devices to keep privacy and security #1, as well as to use IPv6. And he's taking that same mentality to their IoT division. So I'm hopeful that there's more people like them doing that with the right mindset. So I do question whether or not there is good oversight and regulation there at the carrier level, that the people are doing the right thing. There may or may be, I don't know enough about what's happening in carrier or in cable. But what I do know is that some of the engineers that are building these things have the right mindset, but once it's out of their hands, it's up to Comcast to decide how they use those things in this particular case. So
great. Sorry, George, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all right.
Just going to see if I could summarize this a little bit, because I feel like there's an action coming out of this, which I think is pretty exciting. I mean, so let me just tell you guys how I'm thinking of it. Please, Kibitz, chime in. But it feels like there's this concern that the average consumer does not know what's going on in their house today, right? And they could be, if they knew, they probably at a minimum wouldn't be comfortable. And there could be some things that are not great going on with the amalgam of data that's being harvested with so at a minimum, it feels like we've got the brain trust to figure out a way to explain in layperson's terms, educate them on what's happening today. Maybe that's the first step, is to figure out how we would explain that, how we would have the full compendium of everything going on today in terms they can understand. Maybe part B is then things that they might be manually able to do, an average person might be able to do if some of these things make them uncomfortable. Bob, you had some great suggestions in just, simply just not turning on some of the functionalities that you weren't comfortable with your devices. And then it feels like there's this, I don't know, there might be a part C that's a varsity level for someone even more motivated to do some of the more complex things, but maybe some easier instructions for that. So maybe that's all about education and triage today in the house. And then, George, I think where you were going was, then how do we actually work with people? How do we influence what the standards are, what's being built going forward? How can we have some impact and really kind of creating that future? So if folks think that broadly kind of makes sense, I do feel like there's kind of a potentially like a work stream around that we could look at around moving some of that forward.
Well, and how do you change the mindset? Like for Amazon Sidewalk, it's on by default. And I don't remember which state comprehensive privacy law, I don't know if it's passed yet, but one state said opt out by default rather than opt out as an option, right? So at contract or at insertion of a product into that state's privacy law was a restriction that everything should be opt out so like Sidewalk would be disabled, can't be on by default if it potentially is privacy risk.
That's right. And I think actually Amazon had to pivot at the last minute. So I'm in California. It was not turned on because I'm a Ring customer and Amazon customer. And they had to stop short on that. So I don't know if that's national or.
I would double check it. It's on by default. Sidewalk is on.
It is on by default. Yeah.
And Bob, I do want to ask another question. Just it will be a quick question, and I know we are in the last minute. So I'm getting this letter from Chase about privacy, who tells me that there is certain data that I cannot opt off. They can do whatever the heck they want to with my data. And there is certain data that I can opt out. So just sign over here to opt out. Obviously, I opt out. I still don't even know what's the data that I cannot opt out based on that letter that I got. And beyond that, how come my banker, they know about me so much, can play with my data? And the thing is, there aren't that many banks that I can go. I can't just go and move all my account from one bank to another. I mean, it's such an hassle to go do that. I feel being trapped from that aspect. I want to be able to tell my bank nothing can go anywhere to any subsidiary. I don't care what it is.
Yeah, even then you won't be covered because you still have the damn FICO and all the other crap.
And I don't have it, Bob. I don't have it. I don't feel I'm truly being protected. I feel like that people have strength over me just by the mere fact that I'm part of their institution.
Well, that's right. But then I have to come back to what Bob said is basically that's the government, right? And so now you've got the NSA, you've got the data center in Utah running Palantir on a scale that is absolutely unimaginably large. And that's government shit.
I don't care for that. I care for my bank. I mean, I thought bank is personal, I've got a personal banker, by the way. I mean, I know his name.
Well, let's hear what Bob has to say.
Yeah.
So I started writing privacy notices for banks 40 years ago because that's when it came up with the elimination, with the deregulation of banking so that you could have consumer and commercial and investment and insurance all thrown together. And they were no fun to write and they're no fun to read. There's certain information which banks are by law required to keep. It's also the case that for certain services, banks have dozens of subsidiaries that do very specific things. And a lot of that is driven by laws which still limit what banks can do, but in order to provide the services, they do it through subsidiaries or affiliates. So in terms of you're saying, I don't understand what's being done, virtually every bank, any kind of major bank, and I think is required to have an ombudsman. And that's someone who is supposed to give you the answers you're looking for. And if your question is what information are they retaining and who are they sending it to, and you don't understand what from the privacy policy, which I can, again, it's my fault. I wrote some of those policies. Although they've changed a little bit over the last 40 years, then there is someone to talk to at the bank. And if they don't answer, there's this guy named the controller of currency, who also has an ombudsman, and they are required to do it. So you know, it's I feel your pain. I'm sort of the spokesperson for the capitalist society in this this small meeting, but you know, that's their the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which governs the retention and disclosure of data, is a pretty complicated thing, and it's a bad law. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's not particularly good, but you know, so is, you know, you look at FinCEN and the people in the Bank Secrecy Act, which requires information to be kept on people. They're the Know Your Customer rules, which require banks to obtain information so they know that it's, you know, that it's Shmuel and it's not, you know, Hezbollah who's getting it, you know, that kind of thing. So that's where those things are derived from. And I can say you can talk to people about it.
Well,
There
that's
are people who are designated to talk about and give you straight answers. I just can't tell you, you know, I can't tell you that you'll be satisfied with it, either because of the substance of the law or because of the, I mean, no one wants to be the compliance officer. It's not a fun job.
well, my response is real simple. I mean, I continue to work with this bank. I didn't change anything, obviously. It's just to kind of like put the sense of myself as a human being and as a consumer, it's disappointing. I don't feel, I would like to trust my bank. I don't trust my bank anymore.
Yeah, you can't trust your bank, you can't trust your credit union. So no, that's misplaced trust.
So I no longer trust them. That's the answer.
Okay.
And by the way, well, maybe they do everything kosher. Maybe they do everything perfect. It's just that the way they, you know, disseminate the information is.
So we are at the top of the hour on that happy note about not trusting anyone. And I wanted to.
I trust you, Chris.
Will trust me. So I want to just close really quickly. So again, thank you, Bob. And there are two questions I'm going to follow up with you and Jodi afterwards, but I'll just plan them right now real quick. You know, one, where, going back to the regs, where are companies currently falling down the most or at the biggest risk of falling down and meeting CPRA, which it becomes in effect in about a year plus. So it's kind of, what's the biggest risk in people just not executing properly? And then if you ruled the world in this area, what would be one thing you would want to change that you think maybe there's some ineffectual laws that mean well, but they don't really have any teeth or aren't really protecting the customer? So I'll send these to you, but those are the two I was going to plant to you and Jodi to see. So then final thing is we have one more session scheduled, a deep dive, at least one more, but the next session we have scheduled around privacy is a deep dive around the Fourth Amendment and third-party doctrine. So Shmuel and Alex and Nicole and I are going to discuss timing. It'll either be in the September meeting or the October meeting, and I'll have a few other topics around that, but that's one of the ones coming up. So with that, again, Bob, thank you for your time and your input, and you're welcome to, we'll keep you on the list. Please attend any of these you have time for.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thanks very much. It's always good to have a spirited discussion.
Can I add something real quick? Are we done yet?
No, please, George, go ahead.
Go for it.
So I'm from a town called Pollock Pines, California. That's where I grew up. And you may know and be aware that the Caldor fire is raging and it started taking out homes in the Pollock area today and threatening many others, and it's taken out the entire town of Grizzly Flat. So I just want everybody to know that if there's an opportunity when they start popping up to help some of these communities, you know, any kinds of donations would be greatly appreciated to any of those movements. And I'll try to aggregate those and shoot out an email to everyone to make sure that we're donating to the authentic organizations. But it's a really bad situation today. So so just be aware of that. And, you know, I'll, of course, make sure that I vet each of the resources that I send out link-wise. So, and send it to your friends or anybody who else wants to see how they can help. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. And stay safe. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I don't live there anymore. My childhood home is probably going to be gone by the end of the day today, but you know, we moved out of that area many years ago. So
yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Well, thank
All right.
you, everybody, and
Good-
and I hope
good talking to everyone.
I hope to see you on the next meeting as well. And Bob, I love your calm demeanor and the way you respond to things, even though sometimes the discussion is a little bit heated. You're a gem, and thank you for coming to our meeting. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate it. Let me leave it at that. Someone told me when you get a compliment, say thanks and leave it at that. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Everybody.
Okay, everyone, take care. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.